All right, welcome to Tuesday Night Theologetics. Glad you guys made it. Couple of fun announcements tonight. So first, let's see. I got my hair cut. I had to. Let me just explain this. I was going to grow it long, and my hair used to be luscious and blonde, and now it's Brillo pad grayish, old mangy dog style. So I just didn't want to have that anymore. So now we're this. We'll see if we can go, but. So welcome back to Thugville. But here we go. Also, secondly, the book I mentioned Sunday is out. It's Mere Membership. Let me say this, it's not a book, like I think you guys are gonna love it. And I think if you're a person who's watching this, you're gonna like it because it's explaining membership and sort of the mereness of it, like mere Christianity. The idea is like, what really is it? Why does it matter? It's something that I think once you understand it, it'll stay with you and your Christian faith. It's like a good thing kind of going forward. So Mere Membership, you can get it on our website, I believe. You go to the website, you can go to Amazon.com or anywhere books are sold, but Amazon.com, you can do a Kindle or hardback. And I would love for you to read it, put a review out if you want, only if you like it. If you don't like it, that's okay too. I'm sure we'll hear about all that. So, but check it out. And then the Genesis Volume 1, I'm still editing, working through. I really want to see how this does. So like, I think we've sold like 20 copies of the book so far. So this is not, this is an auspicious start. So we'll see how it goes. So far, I can tell we're really riveted by it, but we'll see what happens. And then the Genesis commentary I'm working on as well. Some other stuff in the works. So that's happening. Next week, we're starting a new book for Tuesday night. So this is the last night of this book. So next week, we're going to start Arthur Pink's Attributes of God. So theologetics is theology and apologetics, and so the idea is we just got the AC. I'm going jacketless. Sorry, Brian, it's still kind of warm. Sorry, guys. So we're going to do that. So next week will be the Attributes of God by Pink, and this kind of lets us go back and forth, right? So we go from an apologetics book to a theology book, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the goal here. And then tonight we're going to finish this off, even though there's another chapter after this, really an epilogue as well. Chapter 11 really summarizes the whole thing, and the last few chapters are kind of additions anyways to his book. And so that's all I got. So we're going to be doing all that. That should be fun. And then one other thing, kind of coming down the pipe over the next week or so, the sermon page on our website should start to look a little different, where we're working on sermon summaries. So when you go to that page, like sort of summaries from the sermon will be there along with the video. Kind of easy quote, easy check, easy thing to look at. So it'll just be kind of in one snapshot. And so that's something that we're kind of working on right now, and I'm excited about. So with that, let me pray. God, thank you so much for this book. It has been wonderful. I thank you so much that Lennox put all his work in, and that we've stood here 20 years later, really, to get to watch just sort of the arguments afresh. I pray, Father, we see as these arguments come back, that we understand and are able to be confident, that we're not cowed by the arguments, and that you would help us to be winsome and gentle, but also bold. And I pray, Father, as we move from this into the attributes of God, we're understanding really where theology meets apologetics. I pray that this would be a really fruitful time for the church, that you would use this in a profound way, that you would fill this place with people that are excited to learn these things. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so chapter 11 is what we're in right now. And so what we're dealing with is information theory. I kept saying that this is sort of behind the scenes, what I've been excited about. We're going to cover this, and that's going to end Lennox's theme. The book, again, is God's Undertaker, and it's John Lennox dealing with Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. So this was written in response to that, which came out in 2006. This came out in 2007. The response of the book is phenomenal. It's modest, but there's an undergirding point that Lennox has been very careful, and the reason I like him is that he's a lot more gentle and precise than I am. Richard Dawkins is a man made in the image of God. I want him to know the Lord. I want him to be saved. His arguments in the God delusion are embarrassingly rudimentary. And what I mean by that is there's a constant bait and switch we talked about last week in what he's talking about. First of all, his basic argument that incremental evolution, right, gradualistic evolution is enough to account for the illusion, what he calls it, of design. And we talked about last week that even in his own model, he gets around the sheer challenge of this by inserting a mechanism, just sneaking it in, that's the opposite of blind and the rest that he says. It is an actual organizing principle. And so even in the midst of his theory, I think he might be deluded himself, which is ironic in his title. But then it's this chapter and this thing that we've come back to again and again that I want to focus on. Dawkins is making a mistake that it's a category error. I began this book teaching about the idea of the category error, that there's a difference between physics and metaphysics. There's a difference between science and metaphysics. There's a difference between a worldview and, not an epistemology, but what do we call it? The five senses again. What are we saying? These empirical, thank you. I always forget that word, empirical senses. So the empiricism and the rest, things that you can study, naturalism stuff. There's also immaterial things. And so these understandings are important. So when someone is kind of wearing the lab coat, speaking from a perspective of science, but then saying metaphysical things, you got to wonder, okay, are they just, like, hey, I just came home from work and I went to my kid's soccer game, I'm wearing a suit and I just forgot? Like, or am I saying that my business is also a soccer team? Like, does that make sense? He's wearing a uniform, essentially, in his speech that has nothing to do with the metaphysical statements he's making. And there's a reason he's doing it, is that he's giving himself credibility. And the irony in this is that as a theologian and as a philosopher, Richard Dawkins would not pass first-year philosophy, and certainly not first-year theology. And that's because of his main argument, right? So what we've been saying all along is that the universe is an effect. It's not a cause. It's not something that just is. It's not a brute fact. We know that the universe has a beginning. This is something we know scientifically, at least, as far as you can know anything, is that the things that we assumed in science were brute facts, time and space and all this stuff, physics, the laws of these things didn't always exist. There was a beginning. And so how do we account for that beginning? Because if there's a beginning, that means that the universe is an effect, not a cause. And so if in science, the general rule is that every effect has a cause, and so we would say, well, that cause is ultimately God. And Dawkins would reply and say, oh yeah, well, you've just kicked the can down the road. Who made God? And when you hear him say that, the very fact that he jumps to that argument demonstrates what I've been saying all along, is that he's making a constant and steady category error, and that final sort of rebuttal he makes reveals it. So that's why we want to understand that kind of a little bit. So let me just go through the chapter. It's a little short. I'll go through my paper at the end, and then we'll go from there. So the existence of complex specified information provides a substantial challenge to the notion that unguided natural processes can account for life and make scientifically plausible the suggestion that an intelligent source was responsible. Here it's important to realize that such an inference to an intelligent source based on the nature of DNA is not simply an argument from analogy. Many classical design arguments were of that kind. So in other words, we're not just making an argument. Man, what a night. I realize I don't even need my glasses. I just look down at the page and it's more clear without the glasses, and I'm not charismatic, but maybe it's something just, I'm just kidding. But here we go. So the design inference, I'm like slowly morphing into a meathead. In another second, I'll be wearing a stringer tank top in a second, and I'll be wearing Zumba pants, but every time you look up. But anyways, the design inference from DNA is much stronger than its classical predecessors for the following reasons given in the words of Stephen Meyer. Quote, DNA does not imply the need for an intelligent designer because it has some similarities to a software program or to human language. It implies the need for an intelligent designer because it possesses identical features, namely information content that intelligently designed human texts and computer languages possess. In other words, we're not making an argument from analogy. We're not saying this is sort of like this, or can you see how this would fit in this scenario? What we're saying is the fact that we have DNA, which carries information, not just bits, there's actual content information, means that there's a reader of that information and a giver of that information. There's intelligence behind that, okay? So that's kind of the argument. Meyer's supported by information theorist, a guy named Hubert Yockey, who says, quote, it is important to understand that we are not reasoning by analogy. The sequence hypothesis, that the genetic code works essentially like a book, applies directly to the protein and genetic text, as well as to written language, and therefore the treatment is mathematically identical. So what does that mean? That means that when we're talking about DNA, when we're talking about what it is, essentially, when we say it's like a book, I want you to think for a second what that means. When you're reading this book, we're saying, hey, let's look at this book I wrote. There's no pages in it, at least I hope there aren't, that say things like, hey, Paul's correction begins with 1, 2, 7, 5, 4, 7, C, and then it just has other words. Like, there's words in here that are based on verbiage and nouns and double entendre, different ideas of like, subtlety and jokes and different ways things are. There's all sorts of like information that's being passed in these ways. And it's not just that. For example, we've been using language, but let's use human beings for a second as intelligent people. When we speak to one another, we speak and often communicate not just with our words, but in how we say it, in our tone, and also in maybe like our facial expressions, and maybe also in like the things we do with our hands. Like, for example, if you say to your wife, "How's everything?" and she goes, "Fine." Like, and I say, I'm like, let's say you bring me in for counseling, okay? And I watch this interaction, and the husband like, "See, she said things are fine." Like, she did not say things are fine. You should have known right away that things are not fine. And the husband is like, "But she said with her words," I mean, words are information. She gave me objective information that things are fine. I'm like, no, see, there's more than just the words, right? There's the thing, like, what do you want? How are you doing? Like, I'm fine. Like, or how about this one? "Hey, when you get the time, maybe we could do this." That means you should do this right now, right? That's one idea. You could do this all the way around. You can kind of see what I'm getting at. We do this all the time. There's intelligence behind these motions. Now, just FYI, now take ChatGPT out for a second, but if you're talking to your computer and you say, and it says, "Hey, what task do you want me to do next?" You're not like, "I don't know. I'm not really in the mood to tell you." Like, you don't say that to your computer, except maybe ChatGPT, because you want it to talk to you. But for the most part, we don't do that. We know that there's intelligence, and so it affects how we communicate. So the very idea of DNA and points to what? Intelligence. A guy named Dembski, he wrote a book named The Design Inference, and he said it's devoted to explicating the exact nature of the kind of design inferences that we make from our experience with information-rich systems, such as languages, codes, computers, machines, etc. Such design inferences are actually quite widespread in science. So let's just pretend for a minute that we all work for, I don't know, let's say we're in the CIA or in Russia, we're in the Russian, I forget the Russian CIA. We'll just say we're in, like, the guys that work for some dark agency that has no name. And our job is to figure out if this guy that works at the university is really sending coded messages to China. And you're like, "Matt, this is a really specific thing." Like, and every time we see in his paper, we notice that every other word is capitalized. He's capitalizing odd words. Is it possible that it's just random? I mean, haven't you ever randomly capitalized things? I do. We can always random capitalize things. But if I said to you, if you look through all of his work for the past 5 years, you'll notice that every paper submitted on Wednesdays has every first letter capitalized of the third paragraph. I might say to you, "Hey, this guy's a spy," and that's a code. And even further, if I said, "Oh yeah," and I took the code and it spelled out, "Hey, I'm a spy, and this is my information," that's also kind of information. Like, that's what the DNA, that's what we're trying to say here. Is like, DNA is not like random stuff. It's normal things we would say that are like very, very specific that we say is intelligence. For example, Lennox says this. He says, "A few small marks on a flint are enough to tell an archaeologist that he's dealing with an artifact and not just a piece of weathered stone." When you're in Israel and you pick up a piece of stone, you can tell that this is a 3,000-year-old piece of pottery as opposed to just a rock or an arrowhead, even perhaps. Inferences to intelligent agency are made as a matter of routine in disciplines such as archaeology, cryptography, computer science, and forensic medicine. We've already covered multiple examples, so we know what I'm getting at right now. But in recent years, even natural science has shown itself prepared to make design inferences, notably in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence called SETI. This is the people that are looking for aliens, okay? Now, I'm sort of an expert on aliens now because we have a podcast about it, but I feel like Matt Walsh when he says he's an expert on DEI. But anyways, there's a group called the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, SETI. It's the North American Space Administration, NASA, has spent millions of dollars setting up radio telescopes monitoring millions of channels in the hope of detecting a message from intelligent beings somewhere else in the cosmos. So let's just set aside the fact that scientists might regard the whole project with some skepticism, right? Maybe we're saying, "I don't believe in aliens." Maybe you do. Who cares? But it raised a fundamental question as to the actual scientific methodology they're using to actually detect intelligence in the first place. What do I mean by this? Well, how does one scientifically recognize a message emanating from an intelligent source and distinguish it from the random background noise that emanates from the cosmos? I mean, the only way this can be done, and the only way they do it, is to compare signals received with patterns specified in advance that are deemed to be clear and reliable indicators of intelligence. For example, long sequences of prime numbers, and then you can make a design inference. In SETI, the recognition of intelligent agency is regarded as lying within the legitimate scope of natural science. And so, not social science. This isn't a subjective science. Natural science, we're saying there's a objective certainty that this was intelligence. We might not understand what the message is, but we can understand this is a message sent from one intelligent being to another. We do the same thing all the time when they see, for example, there's a bunch of like funny frauds. There's this one that I forget where, you guys all probably know it, but there's this one thing, it was during COVID, where some guy put some like metal like mirror thing in the middle of the desert. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. Okay, wow. So apparently they just put it there and then left. And it's pretty awesome that someone did that. It's a great practical joke. People are losing their minds. They're like, this is crazy. And I don't go on the internet and reply to anything. But during this time, during COVID, I did go on the internet for a moment and reply for a moment to this. And I said, that's just a coincidence. Nature does all sorts of things with enough time and chance. And no one liked that answer. I found that humorous. But anyways, I'm like, you would expect this with evolution, sometimes with enough possibilities. And then they got mad. I'm like, well, in the multiverse, and that got shut down too. And it was just so interesting. Carl Sagan, astronomer Carl Sagan, thought that a single message from space would be enough to convince us that there were intelligences in the universe other than our own. But there's a bigger observation to be made, right? If we're prepared to look for scientific evidence of intelligent activity beyond our planet, then why are we so hesitant in applying the same type of thinking to what we see here on our planet now, our DNA code and the rest? There seems to be a glaring inconsistency, which brings us to the nub of the question that we've talked about the whole time. Is an attribution of an intelligent design to the universe actually science? Not just metaphysical, but science. And when we talk about science, we emphasize, seem quite happy to talk about things like forensic medicine and SETI in the realm of science. And so what I'm doing is I'm doing the opposite. What I'm saying is that what Dawkins and the rest have been saying is more metaphysics. And now I'm saying, but hold on, what I'm saying is actually probably science. In other words, I'm kind of playing both sides of my mouth, and there's a reason for this. What I mean by that is once we put it this way, the next question asked is, what should we deduce from the overwhelming amount of information that is contained in even the simplest living systems? That word deduce, that word that we're talking about, is kind of what I've been getting at all along. Science, you can use in a more broad term, that we can talk about the interpretation of data. And many people will do that and call that science. I'm like, if we are going to do that, then the premise that there's an intelligent designer, an uncaused cause behind everything, is certainly more scientific than a head monkey somewhere embedded into the monkeys typing on typewriters that Dawkins speaks about. I mean, if we're going to say this is science, our view is certainly more scientific than the rest. But to be modest, I'd be willing to say that here's a metaphysical interpretation of this data. That's the easy way to say it. But that's kind of what I'm getting at, right? At the public announcement of the completion of the Human Genome Project, its director, Francis Collins, said, quote, "It is humbling for me and awe-inspiring to realize that we have caught the first glimpse of our own instruction book, previously known only to God." Gene Myers, the computer scientist who worked on the genome mapping at the Maryland headquarters of Celera Genomics, said, quote, "We're deliciously complex at the molecular level. We don't understand ourselves yet, which is cool. There's still a metaphysical, magical element, which really astounds me, is the architecture of life. The system is extremely complex. It's like it was designed. There's huge intelligence there. I just don't see that as being unscientific. Others may, but I do not." So the reason I brought these two quotes up, and we'll bring up a few more, is that it's the overconfidence from the folks that are saying that as a Christian, the premise that you believe in a sky daddy is just a mockery of a very real, reasonable conclusion that things look designed because they are. Now, the second question is, someone might say to you, well, just because you say that there might be an intelligent designer and there might be a God behind these things doesn't mean it's the God of the Bible. And I'm like, I didn't even say that. That's a separate argument. I don't need to say it is the God of the Bible, but there's a few things we could know about the things we know about this God that might tell us it's the God of the Bible. For example, the God who made everything as an uncaused cause would have to be out of space and time, an eternal present, and I am even. For a God to make everything with intelligence and to make people in his image, I mean, certainly if you could think of a God as, I don't know, like just energy or something, someone would say, yeah, but then if we exist, are we higher than that God? I mean, whatever we think of and conceive of that God, we tend to make ourselves in its image one way or another. So if you say, well, the God is just energy, what people usually say is, well, we're just energy, aren't we? Notice they demean us. There's a lot of things we can tell about God, mainly from just the things we study. I mean, again, the Bible says the heavens declare the glory of God. It tells us lots about it, but we don't need to get there. That's not even our argument, right? Let's do a couple more quotes here. I think it's interesting. Considerations of this kind have been instrumental in altering the thinking of some very prominent thinkers. Observational cosmologist Alan Sandage, whom we mentioned earlier, discussing his conversion to Christianity at the age of 50, which isn't old, said, quote, "The world is too complicated in all its parts and interconnections to be due to chance alone. I'm convinced that the existence of life with all its order in each of its organisms is simply too well put together," unquote. And very recently, philosopher Anthony Flew gave as a reason for his conversion to theism, after over 50 years of atheism, that biologists' investigation of DNA has shown, quote, "shown by the almost unbelievably complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved," unquote. So what we're clearly moving towards, considering in this whole idea, is the idea that information and intelligence are fundamental to the existence of the universe and life, and far from being the end products of an unguided natural process, starting with energy and matter. Instead, they were involved from the very beginning. So I said this to you in the beginning, right? So what Dawkins is trying to get us to have to consider is that matter became mind. That you had matter, stuff, inorganic stuff, mind you. You just had chemicals, even. And somehow, this inorganic stuff became organic. That's a big jump. All right, well, let's go with it. That jump from inorganic to organic became people, and then became minds, and then became metaphysics, and then became truth and reason. What's the mechanism for that? Intelligent design certainly doesn't work. I mean, it doesn't. None of it. I mean, rather, evolutionary idea, like the big E, it doesn't answer that. The other alternative is that what comes first? Mind comes before matter. In other words, God said, and it was so. An uncaused being in the beginning was the Word. The Word came first, an immaterial beginning that led to matter. Mind became matter. Which one actually makes sense of reality? The latter. Which one actually makes sense of all the science we have? The latter. This is not an immodest statement when you get down to brass tacks, right? I mean, the idea that we go from this idea of, matter into mind is so ginormous, just the sheer confidence with which people say without any blushing or recognizing how big of a statement they make should get you to understand that it's bluster. That's what it is. That's what we're dealing with, is bluster. For example, in The New Scientist, under the intriguing title, quote, "In the beginning was the bit," there's an account by Hans Christian von Baer of the word of physicist Anton Zeilinger of the University of Vienna. Zeilinger advances the thesis that in order to understand quantum mechanics, one has to start by associating information in terms of bits with so-called elementary systems in quantum mechanics, which, like the spin of an electron, carry one bit of information. There are only two possible outcomes for measuring spin, up or down. He goes on and argues that his basic principle gains credibility by leading directionally in three pillars of quantum theory. And he gets into it, quantization itself, uncertainty, and quantum entanglement. You're like, oh, I don't even know what he's saying, but okay. But his proposal that information is to be regarded as fundamental is the thing I'm focused on. Information is fundamental, something that's not directly in the bit itself. It's the information the bit is carrying. It's not a new idea. It's been around for centuries. In the beginning was the Word, and all things were made by him, wrote the Apostle John, author of the fourth gospel. It's surely very striking, indeed, that at the heart of the biblical analysis of the creative acts, it's so cavalierly dismissed by many, we find the very concept that science in recent times has also shown to be of paramount importance, the concept of information. This is so big. For example, when we say that information comes first, and you say, okay, Matt, I think you're reaching. I want you to understand that the Greeks, and I brought this up multiple times, but you have to understand that John is writing John in a culture where the Greek mind, you remember Paul is in Athens on Mars Hill. I mean, this is directly engaging like Zeno and Parmenides and all these, and Plato and these ideas that he's dealing with right away, right? So in the Greek mind, they had this issue of like, remember Paul on Mars Hill goes to talk about the unknown God. And so their basic argument had to do with metaphysics and being. And so in their view, remember, whatever God exists, they believe that everything that exists has a cause. They believe this in the Greeks. And they knew that if you believed in the gods of Zeus, the gods, plural of Zeus and Hermes and, Aphrodite and all the rest, and they're like hanging out, talking to each other. What's happening? Well, they speak to each other and they change. Interaction means change. It means linearity. It means when this God talks to this God, he's mad. He didn't used to be mad, now he was mad. He wasn't mad before. That means change. And so those gods aren't suitable to be an effective cause of everything because they themselves are also effects of other things that have happened to them. They're not a suitable first cause. Everyone with me a little bit? And so they posited there must be some God that exists before them that's unchanging, that's a suitable uncaused cause. And furthermore, that God, whoever it is, must be eternally present but in motion. Why do they say that? Because they said, well, for me to be a human being, a self, how do I go from Athens to Rome? They said, well, I can't go from Athens to Rome. They're like, why? Well, because it would cause me to have to move halfway there. And if I moved halfway between Athens and Rome, the me that's here now would be halfway between Athens and Rome, right? I wouldn't be me anymore. I'd be the me that's standing between halfway there. And if I want to get halfway there, I'd have to stand halfway there. And the me that's standing halfway there is not the same me that's standing here. And they went all the way back. They said, there's no way to get from Athens to Rome. You can't do it. You can't move. And yet we can move from Athens to Rome, which means we must be inside the unmoved mover. That whatever God exists is outside of space and time, unchangeable, but constantly in motion, hence we move. Their argument came down to the idea that we are always an I was or a will be, never an I am. But there must be an I am who's in constant motion. And Paul comes to them on Mars Hill in Athens and says, let me tell you about that God. That's the one who in Genesis, in Exodus, when Moses says, what should I say your name is? God says, I am that I am. God's the only one that calls himself the I am. And all of a sudden, Jesus comes along, and 7 times in particular in the Gospel of John, actually more than that, but 7 particular times, Jesus gives these 7 I am statements. They're all around a miracle. They're all around something fulfilling. And each one he says, ego eime. In Greek, it means I am, I am. And more properly, using a double like that actually means I myself and no one but me am. And so when they say at one point they come to arrest Jesus, or when the guys are talking to Jesus in John 8, and they say, Jesus said, Abraham saw my day and he was glad. They're like, you're not yet 50 years old and you saw Abraham. And Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. And for that, they wanted to stone him to death for the crime of blasphemy. When they went to arrest Jesus, they say, who do you seek? They say, Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, I am. And they all fell to the ground. This statement that Jesus was making was directly quoting all the way back to Exodus, saying that I am. I am the unchanging one. The one we nailed to the cross claimed to be the unchangeable God who spoke everything into being. And just so we don't miss it, John begins his gospel with that. In John 1, what does he say? In the beginning was the Word. What does that word mean in Greek? It means logos. In the beginning was the logos. And the logos was with God, and the logos was God. Now, remember, this is Greek, Koine Greek. Why not say in the beginning was Jesus? Why does John use the word logos to describe Jesus? And because John knows that there's an idea embedded in Greek thinking, and this is a first century book, and in that Greek thinking, they believed that this uncaused God that inhabits everything, that had to do so with wisdom. And so the logos in the Greek mind was the wisdom of God. It was the sort of the wisdom of everything, the wisdom behind everything. It was the wisdom of the cosmos, right? And so when John says in the beginning was the logos, and the logos is with God, and the logos was God, talking about Jesus, it's basically saying this: if God is not linear and outside of space and time, God doesn't think one thing then another. When I think of things, I think of one thing, and then it leads to my next thought. And if you say something, then I think of the next thought. I think linearly, but linear thinking requires, right, chronology. It requires time. It requires me doing one thing then the next. But God is outside of space and time. So when we say that God knows every number, you know how God knows every number? He doesn't know it from counting them. He knows it because all the numbers are eternally present in God. God knows them all because God is. Another way to say it is God thinks all thoughts at once. And when you take all those thoughts at once, how could you ever know that, God? You can't. We're in space and time. So what did God do? What did he say? The Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen him as the only God from the Father, full of grace and truth. What John is saying is so profoundly, metaphysically, philosophically, profound and deep at the highest level for people like Richard Dawkins, who don't know anything at all, to dismiss this and say, who made God, shows that he hasn't even engaged at the most sophomoric level of the most basic arguments of God's existence from the Bible and from all these thinkers for thousands of years. Didn't even look. By definition, he's a fool. A fool speaks about something they don't know. I'm not claiming to be a physicist or anything else, but I'm not talking about physics or chemistry tonight or any of these nights I've been talking about. I've been talking about worldview, metaphysics, things I know quite a lot about, things the Bible speaks about very confidently. I just find this so fascinating that the Bible is so specific about all these things. And when we understand information in this idea, the carriers of information can be visible, paper, right? Writing, smoke signals, television, DNA, but the information itself is invisible. It's made visible. Like the wisdom of God and Jesus was made visible to us. We could see it because we could see Jesus, but it doesn't mean that the wisdom of God is visible. Does that make sense? It's manifest to us. We've seen his glory. Information's not only, though, invisible, it's immaterial, right? That's what we've been saying. For example, if you're looking at your phone or a book, or if you're ordering pants right now or whatever you're doing, what's happening? Photons bounce off the book or your iPad or whatever, and they're received by your eye. Photons, particles of light. And they're converted into electrical impulses and transmitted to your brain. And so you say, well, great, but where's the information? Well, suppose you pass on some information from this book to a friend by word of mouth. The sound waves carry information from your mouth to your friend's ear, from where they're converted into electrical impulses and transmitted to his brain. And your friend now has the information that originated in your mind, but nothing material has passed from you to your friend. The carriers of the information are material, right? Sound waves, light waves. But the information itself is not material. Do you guys all follow what I'm saying? What is it? It's one mind speaking to another mind through symbols. I'm saying words, they're just sounds. If I immediately start saying, you're like, that's also sounds, but there's no intelligibility to it. This idea of information is a big deal because it recognizes there's an immaterial aspect to all of this. It's basic. So then what do we do with what is the dream of materialist explanation for everything? How does that work then? How could purely material causes account satisfactorily for immaterial things like information? Dawkins thinks that the considerations of complexity actually clinch his case against God. Quote, any God capable of designing a universe must be a supremely complex and improbable entity who needs an even bigger explanation than the one he is supposed to provide. In other words, he argues that this is no explanation, since by definition, God is more complex and therefore less probable than the thing you're explaining. Spelling out, he claims, quote, to explain the origin of DNA or a protein machine by invoking a supernatural designer is to explain precisely nothing, for it leaves unexplained the origin of the designer. You have to say something like God was always there, and if you allow yourself that kind of lazy way out, you might as well just say DNA was always there or life was always there and be done with it. I want to pause for a second. I'm not making a caricature of his argument. That is his argument. It's just shameful because he's popular. People bought his books and then parroted these ideas. I don't feel like people need to be mocked for that, but please, Christian, do not be afraid of people that speak confidently quoting Dawkins. Does it make sense? You see what I'm trying to say? Like the guy quoting this guy confidently intimidates you. Why? Isn't it interesting that when you look under the hood, the ridiculousness of his argument, and I say that boldly. I love it because there'll be shorts, and the comments on the comment section on the little shorts are from people that are so ignorant. Any of you are welcome to come out and talk to us and educate us on all your information and knowledge. It's fascinating the confidence people have. Dawkins' point is highly logical. First, we know that DNA wasn't there. We know that scientifically. It's ironic you say, well, we could just say it was always there. I'm like, wouldn't that go against science? Secondly, we know that life wasn't always there. And we also kind of know that the universe wasn't always there. So his earlier argument that we could just say something else was always there and be done with it is either dumb or like it's either illogical or he's not being serious. It's one of the main reasons why scientists actually seek explanations for their existence, right? Because we know that they came about. But the real issue is that he appears to believe that the only kind of explanation that's worthy of the name scientific is one that proceeds from simple to complex. Now, Lennox goes into this a little bit. I get not lost, I get stuck here. Dawkins' argument is also falling apart because he says the argument for God, whoever made everything, has to be complex. Again, our claim isn't that God is complex. Our claim is that God is the simplest, undivided being there is. You're saying, Matt, that's a big statement. I'm like, do you understand that statement? How many of you could acknowledge that that's a complex statement? Something you maybe, how many of you could say you haven't really thought through or meditated on the simplicity of God before? Because they want to admit that they haven't really. It's kind of a hard thing. Yeah. Well, we're gonna. What we're talking about, these theological attributes of God, have been studied, written about. Mountains of ink have been spilled about the attributes of God for thousands of years. None of this is like off the mark thinking. This is the basic thinking that's to be engaged for 1,000, 2,000 years of Christianity. And Dawkins just skips over it, jumps over it, claims the opposite, and says, that's silly. Would you give credibility to someone like that? That's like absurd. Again, let's think of the physicist then as an attempt to explain the falling of an apple, which surely is a simple event in the sense that it readily is grasped by ordinary people. But its explanation in terms of Newton's law of gravitation is already too complicated for most people, and a relativistic explanation in terms of curved space-time leaves all but the expert behind. If we're going to reject explanations on the basis they're more complex, we'd have to reject a great deal of science. Again, atoms are simpler than living creatures, since living creatures are complex structures made up of atoms. Should we just say people don't exist because that's more complex? Or which one of the reasons elementary particle physics continues to attract some of the most powerful intellects on Earth? The deeper down you probe into the ultimate nature or the structure of the universe, the more complex it actually seems to become. The, quote, simple things that physicists understand are not so simple after all. Think of relativity, quantum mechanics, or better still, quantum electrodynamics. Like if you meet someone that says, hey, what do you do for a living? You're at a cocktail party. You're like, hey, what do you do for a living? You're like, I do quantum electrodynamics. You're like, awesome. Cool. What do you do? I'm like, I work at Kinko's, right? Now, that's great too. I can explain it. Now, I could say, I work at a place that spontaneously combusts. Like, you can make up things, but quantum electrodynamics is a pretty big name. In fact, it's such a big name that only most intelligent human minds really grasp even what he's talking about. Dawkins is simply wrong, in other words, of his limited view of what counts as an explanation. First, things that he takes to be simple really aren't that simple. And secondly, the reason that such complex physical theories are accepted by scientists is not because of their simplicity, but because they have good explanation power. Explanatory power is just as, if not more important for the validity of scientific theory as something being simple is. In other words, its ability to explain things is what makes something useful as a theory in science. Sometimes simpler theories have to be discarded because they didn't have sufficient explanatory power. It was, after all, Einstein who said, explanations should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. Explanatory power often trumps simplicity, a fact that Dawkins seems not to appreciate. The issue is so important that later we explore it further. Postulating the existence of a being that's even more complex than the thing you're attempting to explain is something scientists constantly do. I read a 400-page book entitled The God Delusion. It's in fact, is the fact that as an explanation, I postulate a being named Richard Dawkins, who is immeasurably more complex than the book itself, really to be thought of as a non-explanation. Like, that's his argument. It's a terrible argument. And you don't need 400 pages to convince us that valid explanations are the more complex than the things that they need to be explained. I mean, imagine an archaeologist who points at 2 scratch marks on the wall of a hitherto unexplored cave, and he says, human intelligence. Well, if you take Dawkins' logic, he's like, don't be ridiculous. Those scratch marks are very simple. After all, there are only 2 of them. It's no explanation to postulate the existence of something as complex as a human brain to account for such simple scratch marks on a cave wall. What would we say then if she patiently goes on to say the 2 simple scratches form the Chinese character ren for a human being? That is, they have a semiotic dimension. Would those carry meaning? Would we still maintain that explaining the scratch marks in terms of human activity explains precisely nothing? Of course not. We would admit her inference to intelligent activity as legitimate. We've covered this. But incidentally, it's not to be wondered at that our archaeologists immediately infer intelligent origin when faced with 2 scratches, whereas sometimes scientists who have 3.5 billion letter sequences of the human genome inform us that it's to be explained solely in terms of chance and necessity. Both the scratches and the DNA sequence have a semiotic dimension. It's not for nothing that we call the latter the DNA code. The legitimization of the SETI project we already referred to, as we've seen, uses precisely the same argument. Again, if we were to receive a signal, as Carl Sagan's novel Contact talks about, consisting of a sequence of prime numbers, we would assume it was coming from an intelligent source. What's more, such an event, were it to happen, would dominate the world's press overnight, and no scientist would ever dream of objecting that postulated intelligent origin of the sequence was not an explanation, since it would be tantamount to explain the sequence in terms of something more complex than the sequence itself. In other words, no one would reject it, like we already covered. The elementary point to be made here is this. Let's see what I'm saying here. We're not attempting to give an explanation of ultimate complexity, whatever that might mean, or even of complexity in general. We're trying to explain one particular example of organized complexity, life, and it's therefore perfectly sensible to do that in terms of something that is more complex. Again, whatever. And if that's what's demanded by the evidence. And the evidence, as we've seen, is that 1, life involves a complex DNA database of digital information. 2, the only source we know of such language-like complexity is intelligence. 3, theoretical computer science indicates that unguided chance and necessity are incapable of producing semiotic or language-like complexity. Pretty basic. So on the basis of making a scientific inference to the best explanation, you'd have thought that scientists would like or prefer an explanation that explains a phenomena over an explanation that doesn't. The fact that this is not the case in thinking about origins of life shows that an a priori, coming before, a prior, materialism can produce a profoundly anti-unscientific attitude, which is to say that it's an unwillingness to actually follow the evidence where it clearly leads simply because you don't like the implications of where it leads. And that's Dawkins' biggest problem. The last objection we're going to deal is this. There's another objection to the existence of God that's related to the preceding one, which he made it and he said it again and again. It's the age-old schoolboy teaser. Dawkins made it the central issue in his book, The God Delusion. So it's not just a side throwaway remark. It's the central argument he makes. If we say God created the universe, we have to ask who created God and so on. So that according to Dawkins, the only way out of an impossible infinite regress is to deny that God exists. Again, I want to say this again. Like, I would understand this from a first-year student that's never engaged the arguments. That's not what anyone's saying. I mean, Lennox, who's so kind, is like, is that really the best that they can do? I can hear an Irish friend saying, well, it proves one thing. If they had a better argument, they would have used it. The fact he goes on, again, he just deals with it. I think the issue here in all of this is, like when he says God, for example, he says, who made God? What he means is he's mistaking what we say about cause and effect. The Christian argument is not that every effect has a cause. The Christian argument, the cosmological argument, or what's otherwise known as the Kalam cosmological argument, is it's not that everything exists has a cause, it's that everything that begins to exist has a cause. That's the idea. God didn't begin to exist, he just is. Whatever the uncaused cause is, it didn't have a beginning. This is necessitated in general, and the Bible makes it very central. In other words, the scientific metaphysics gets to the place of dealing with we have to find an uncaused cause, and the Bible begins with it. It's very basic about it, but it's very central to it. It starts in Genesis 1. It's repeated in John 1. This idea is kind of a big one. The fact that Dawkins asked the question about who made the maker shows he may have a conceptual difficulty with envisaging the existence of something uncreated and eternal. And so, if that's the case, he's guilty of further serious inconsistency. You would have thought that his worldview obliged him to believe, in common once more with the ancient Greeks, that matter and energy and the laws of nature were always there. And if that's the case, he does believe in something eternal. Matter and energy. Right? But we know that that's not the case. Science goes against that. He says it used to intrigue me on many visits to former communist places, how often old-style communist academics would ask me the question, who made God? And it was interesting to see the dilemma they got into when their own belief in the eternity of matter was pointed out. In other words, they say that matter was always here, and they say, well, who made God? I'm like, why? You can't have it both ways, right? Eternal energy, yes, but eternal person, no. Where's the logic in that? So kind of as he goes through, that's his basic point. The burning question is this: in which direction does science point? Matter before mind or mind before matter? The answer to that question will surely have to be determined, as always, by following Socrates' advice, examining the evidence and seeing where it leads, however threatening this may turn out to be to our preconceived notions. Christian, I'm going to end the book here. We have nothing to fear from the microscope or the telescope. Nothing at all. It is God's universe. And if we did have something to fear, we need to stop being Christians. Our faith, I want to remind you, our faith in God is not a preference. I don't believe in God because I like Pepsi more than Coke. And so this is an experience. You've heard my testimony. We've said it a million times. If you go back on that podcast, whatever, we talked about it more. But one of the things that was really profound to me in the first year of being a Christian was that I believed it was true. And we're like, everyone believes it's true. I'm like, no, I don't think you get this. If you've grown up in the faith, that's great. That's great. But until you come from somewhere else, I was always willing to leave my faith. The first year of being a Christian, I was willing to not be a Christian very vehemently. And people don't believe it, but I still am today. That seems less believable because I have so many incentive structures to believe, right? Like, I make my living being a Christian. I've spent all these years. I have incentive structures that make that seem less believable. But that first year of being a Christian, I had no incentive structures. I had every reason not to believe, and I was very willing not to believe. Now, I'm just telling you my story, but the thing that hit me over and over again is when someone said that the Bible is inconsistent somewhere, where I had to make a jump somewhere. The Bible didn't make sense of this. I had to overlook that. I would always say in every case, well, I'll leave my faith then. If it's true, it doesn't mean everything's understandable, but it means it corresponds to reality. It's not self-contradictory, some basic things. And so when I go to study it out, I'm like, I actually willingly went to look, and I was willing to not believe. I don't believe in Jesus because I prefer it. I believe in Jesus because I believe it's true. I believe that what happened actually happened in space and time and history. It's true objectively for everybody, whether they like it or not. It is a true fact. It's not my reality or my truth. It's the truth, and therefore I believe it to be true. So when someone says, hey, I'm not sure about that, or I'm going to look under a microscope, I'm going to go see it, I'm like, great. And if I'm wrong, we should see it. We're not Mormons. God's not tricking us. There's so few basic things that the Bible says that God created a mature universe that he spoke into existence. I'm not stressed by the appearance of age. This isn't a fiction. The Bible describes it. I'm not stressed by miracles. The very fact that they're not normative is the very fact that they're called a miracle, but the fact that God made everything, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, my argument rests on the man Christ, who made God known. If Jesus is who he says he is, that's where my belief is. But I want to go back to this central question, and this is how I want to transition into the end of the night. This is a paper I wrote. It's called Who Made God? One of the most common objections raised by Richard Dawkins and many of the so-called new atheists is the question, quote, if everything has a cause, then who made God? Many Christians hear that question and feel a moment of intimidation. It sounds clever, and it sounds scientific, and it sounds like it exposes a flaw in our belief in God. But in reality, the question reveals something quite different. It reveals a basic philosophical misunderstanding of what the Christian claim about God actually is. The problem with the question is not that it's difficult. The problem is that it's confused from the beginning. And this is the point. If you answer it, you've already given up the position. Notice the structure of the objection. The critic assumes a premise. Everything must have a cause. Then he asks if everything has a cause, who caused God? That is not our claim. Christian theology has never argued. The Bible does not argue that everything has a cause. The classical argument has always been that everything that begins to exist has a cause, or that everything contingent requires an explanation. God is what's known as a necessary being. Everything else is contingent upon him. Well, that's a very different claim. I want to drive home again. The fact that that claim isn't being addressed. Why is that? Why is Dawkins and the rest writing a book addressing a claim we're not making and saying, checkmate, Christian? Why do that? The Christian understanding of God is not that he is one more being in the universe who needs a cause. The claim is that God is the uncaused cause. He is the necessary being upon whom all contingent reality depends. So when someone asks who made God, they're not exposing a flaw in the Christian view. They're misrepresenting the Christian view. It's like asking, if all bachelors are unmarried men, then which woman is a bachelor married to? The question collapses under its own misunderstanding. What's striking about this objection is that it's often presented as if it were a scientific critique. But it's the opposite. It's not scientific at all. Again, it's philosophical and theological. Science studies processes within the universe, things that occur within space, time, matter, energy. But the question of why the universe exists at all isn't a scientific question. Again, it's a metaphysical one. And the moment someone asks about the cause of the universe itself, they've already stepped outside the domain of empiricism and into the territory of philosophy and theology. And ironically, this is exactly where many new atheists reveal they're actually out of their depth. And that's the whole thing. What I would urge you to do is when someone starts to make these claims, be very kind. Don't be condescending like them, but ask them, say, hey, you're making metaphysical claims. Have you engaged any serious metaphysical works that disagree with you? I don't need to do that. My argument's so profound. I'm like, you realize that that's what a fool says. That's a foolish thing. So let me just get this straight. You haven't engaged any of the best metaphysical arguments against your position, and you wrote a book and you're confidently pointed out as a checkmate. All right, enjoy your day. That's the pebble. That's all. You don't need to get into more. It's a foolish inquiry. It's a foolish place to stand. For thousands of years, some of the greatest minds in history, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Anselm, Leibniz, and many others have wrestled deeply with the nature of God as the necessary ground of existence. And you can disagree with them. You can say, I don't like this. I don't like what Augustine says about certain things. I don't like what Aquinas says about certain things. I think he's wrong about certain things, but I definitely would say, I understand your argument. That's an important thing. We are right now, today, are the worst at this. We don't even read books. They used to have a thing called Cliff's Notes. Now we have ChatGPT. And people say, tell me what this book is about. We need to read books. But let me just say this. We don't read source material very often. We don't read heavy things. So that Mere Membership book that I have here, I put at the back of the book, I put like a bibliography of books you can look out. Like, there's Augustine on baptism, right? You have John Calvin, Institutes of Christian Religion. We have Jonathan Leeman, Reach on Church Membership, right? It's a short one. We have the Didache, the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, which was translated by Michael Holmes. Like, you go look up these things and go check it out, source material. Now, you don't have to. I just gave you what I think. And if you're not going to check those things out, enjoy what I said. If you're going to think strongly against what I say, you should probably go check out some source material and kind of have an argument. Otherwise, what do we normally say? I don't like that because it doesn't feel like this, and I like this more because I feel like I like it more. All of our arguments are I like Pepsi more than Coke. But that's not what this is about. And so when Dawkins is giving the illusion of an argument, we're like, that's good enough for me. What I'm asking for you to do is to ask people to engage certain things. They say, well, what works are you engaged? I'm like, I'm engaging your work. That's what I'm engaging. You would expect critics to engage the thing they're criticizing pretty seriously. We've done that for the last couple months, haven't we? At least with Dawkins. But often they don't. Instead, they bypass centuries of philosophical reflection and treat God as though he were simply a powerful creature inside the universe. But that's not the Christian doctrine at all. We've taught months on that. The God of Scripture is not a being among other beings. He is being itself. He is uncreated. He is unchanging. He is simple, meaning he is not composed of parts that can be divided or altered. He's outside time and space, the very creator of time and space. It's why the Bible speaks of him the way it does. Again, when Moses asks God his name in Exodus 3, what does he say? I am who I am. The name Yahweh points to his self-existence. God is the one who simply is. He does not come into being. He does not depend on anything outside himself. He is the eternal, self-existent reality upon which all other reality depends, upon which all other reality is contingent. Everything else in the universe is a derived existence. God alone is necessary existence. This is why also the statement of Jesus, again, is so significant. His claims are so significant. When someone says, well, Jesus didn't claim to be God, I'm like, well, clearly the God didn't claim to be God. You don't take God at his word. Why would you take Jesus? But if we understand the claims of God in Exodus, then the claims of Jesus become pretty big. And then the Jewish people who understood that wanted to stone him for this claim. Again, he wasn't claiming to be a prophet or a moral teacher. He was claiming to share in the eternal self-existent nature of God himself. What Jesus was saying is, as you crucify me, as those hands that are nailing me to the cross are being nailed to a cross by hands upheld by me. The very words used to condemn and mock Jesus came from breath borrowed and held together by his very existence. His claims were so profound. And to deny him or say, I think he's a great teacher, is dishonest at the best. When someone asks, who made God? Christians, you just don't feel intimidated. The question, again, reveals a misunderstanding of the very concept. Again, if God were something that could be made, caused, or produced, he wouldn't be God. He'd simply be another creature. But the Christian claim that there must be ultimately a reality that doesn't depend on something else. And guess what? That's what also science is looking for too, isn't it? Nothing would exist at all without this uncaused cause, whatever it is. The universe cannot explain itself. Contingent things cannot account for their own existence. And at some point, explanation has to terminate in a necessary self-existent being. This is what we mean when we speak of God. But again, this points to something deeper, doesn't it? Apologetics is helpful. It answers objections, it removes confusion, but apologetics is not our goal. Apologetics is a means to lead us to something far richer. If you get to a place in apologetics with a serious person who's really gets to the point of deconstruction, the next place you should always end up is theology. Theology is the study of God, not merely defending God, but knowing him, understanding his nature, his character, understanding his attributes as revealed in Scripture. What do I mean by this? Well, the attributes of God are not things we learn merely from nature, but from his revealed word. So for that reason, as I mentioned before, beginning next week, we're going to start studying the attributes of God by A.W. Pink. It's a phenomenal book. It's a challenging book. It's way harder than what we're doing. It's challenging, and it's so rewarding. Some of you were here when we did this in the past, probably like more than a decade ago, and a few of you I know said it changed your life. Our goal isn't just to answer objections, but to know who God is so we can worship him rightly, so we can understand when people are making a mockery or misunderstanding him, we would see that and spot that right away. The God who is not made, who does not change, who simply is the great I am. When Dawkins says, "Who made God?" it demonstrates right away that there's your opening. We need to be able to explain where he's off. And the fact that that is intimidated so many Christians tells me that so many Christians don't have a basic grasp of the most fundamental aspects of theology. And so to start next week, we'll get into it. So let me say a prayer. God, thank you so much for this book. Thank you so much for the one we're going to be going into. Help us to be faithful with it. Help us to understand what you'd have us understand. I pray that we would be effective evangelists, effective apologists, that we would know you better, that it would make us more winsome, make us not just deconstructionists, but people able to talk about you. And we pray for those that are so confident, so full of bluster, that we would recognize that those are people made in your image, and they need your gospel. They're not our enemies, they're our mission field. Help us understand how to use a scalpel, not a hammer, whenever possible. I pray, Father, you'd help us be effective, that we'd hear people come to Christ this side of heaven or the next, that we can hear the story, rather, that you've done something through all this teaching. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. See you next week.